a lot of potential clients. So anyway, I've been watching this since it came out, and glad to be here to help Joanne with the presentation and answer questions later.
Perfect. All right. Thanks so much. So why are we setting this up? Many of you have reached out and have many questions about all of this. We also had many questions about it when we found out about it just a few weeks ago. Um, and clearly, the city hasn't been very transparent with this whole process. It was just dropped on people with very minimal notifications. People missed a lot of people missed the open house that the city held. And even after talking to the city, which to their credit, they're reaching out to a lot of you who have been submitting public comment. But even after talking to the city, what we're seeing is a lot of people are still confused or maybe not very convinced that this is really not a big deal. And so we wanted to set this up. Obviously, this is not organized by the city. This is organized by us. We've been looking at the ordinance. We've been talking to people. We've been talking to the city. Obviously, Jared is an expert in all of this stuff, and that's why he's here to help us out as well. So I guess the disclaimer here is that you should just just like with anything, you should be careful with what you believe, not just because we're telling you that something is bad, which essentially is what we're going to tell you here. You should believe us. We would like to encourage you to go and read the ordinance, talk to the city, and ask them to provide you very specific examples to point you to where in the law the things that they're saying, they're telling you are reflected and that you make up your mind. And so this is to help you. Again, take it with a grain of salt because at the end of the day, all this stuff is very complicated, and you need to make up your mind for your own on your own side. So many of you know, like I've been in Santa Barbara for 5 years, so I didn't have to deal with this back in the day. But 25 years ago, roughly 20 years ago, many of you had to deal with something very similar. The city tried to also come up with regulations for brick buffers. Um, there was this study that was put by Quest Engineering that the city is still using nowadays. Essentially, that's the study that they referenced when they presented all of this in the CRICS Advisory Committee meeting. And that report was essentially paid for by the city. This company was asked to provide essentially suggestions on regulations that would improve creek habitat and safety and all of that stuff. That was essentially rolled back in 2024. There was quite a bit of opposition. I know some of you, I see some of you here that were involved in that, so you for sure have more details than I do have. Um, and so it seems that everything was parked for several years. In 2018, creek buffers were reintroduced in coastal zones. I don't know how much that was discussed with stakeholders or property owners, or whether it flew under the radar. But as of today, there are creek buffers in coastal zones. Um, and then in 2023, the city again started working on this creek buffer ordinance that they just shared with us several weeks ago. So I wanted to stress this because this has been going on for at least a year, definitely more than a year and a half. And so it was only until second half of January that they notified people. You all know what the notification looked like. Many of us, even I missed it. My neighbor had to tell me about it. Um, and just a couple of days ago, I think the city announced that they will be making changes to the ordinance text based on the feedback they have been receiving. Sounds like they're looking at a timeline of end of summer for a new draft and a new public comment period. So we'll see what happens with that. We don't know. We don't know what changes that we're going to be making. So what we're going to be talking about here is what the current draft says. So basically, this is their initial proposal, what they put out to people, and what they honestly seems that they wanted to get approved. If there hadn't been so many people, if we none of us had been complaining, probably they would have just passed it to the planning commission and then to the council and probably approved. Um, so um, here's what the ordinance does. Introduces a new chapter in the municipal code. This new chapter is called Development Along Creeks. It basically regulates what you can do in around creeks, and it defines there's different types of creeks. It defines where the creek buffer is, and then it puts a ton of regulations that we're going to cover in a second. The different creeks, I'm sure you're all aware of, are the major creeks, which essentially is what people think of creeks when you talk to them. Then there's the flood control project creeks, which are essentially major creeks, but it's just those parts of the creeks that have been modified to prevent flooding. And then there's minor creeks, which I'm sure many of you are puzzled about based on the questions that we've been getting. This is like essentially anywhere where water could flow. Like the definition in the ordinance is super vague. And that's one of the main problems, one of the many problems that we're seeing with it. Um,
Hey,
as
Joan,
for,
could I
yeah,
stop you
for
real
sure,
quick
go
on
for
that
it.
one? Just go back to minor creeks.
Yep.
So that quote right there, that is literally what this ordinance says. It says any creek that's not a major creek or a flood control creek is a minor creek. And so that's anything else. And there's a definition that says naturally occurring water course that is natural or has been modified or whatever. But that's basically everything. So just for example, if you have a property where, let's say your property is a 50 by 100-foot lot, and in your backyard, on one side of it, there's a pipe, and water comes out of that pipe into a ditch on your property and flows 50 feet south across your property in the ditch and goes back into another pipe. You have a minor creek on your property. The city has minor creeks or some minor creeks mapped on their GIS map. Like the one that's right next to my house is actually mapped, but there are hundreds of these. I mean, I'm just guessing, but it's probably more than that. But these things are all over the place, and the city has no idea where they are or how many properties these affect, and and they haven't had a way to really, they don't have a way to really know where these are at all until they come up when you come in with a project. And then it's going to come up, and then you've got a 15-foot buffer along your minor creek on both sides of it.
Oh, thanks, Jared. And something I forgot to mention here, under the titles in the slides, you may see numbers, and here you see 22.26.020. This is the section in the ordinance that where this is defined, or like the references what we're talking about in each specific slide. I know that people don't have the time or the expertise. Definitely, I mean, I can speak for based on my own experience, because I was not an expert in this. Not that I am now, but I know a lot more than I used to know. But again, we would like to encourage people to go back to the ordinance text and essentially fact check what we're telling you. Make sure that you agree with it. And these are sort of the pointers so that you know where to go, because it's pretty long. Creek buffers. There's a 25 feet buffer along Mission Creek that's existing. There's also 50 feet from the top of the bank, although it's a little more complicated than the top of the bank in coastal zones, because they also define it as kind of where the edge of the essentially vegetation or riparian area ends. So anyway, it's a little complicated, but that 50 buffer feet exists in coastal zones. And then what they're proposing is this new buffers, 50 feet from the top of the bank of major creeks, 35 feet from the top of the bank of flood control creeks, and 15 feet from the top of the bank of minor creeks. Top of the bank, we don't really talk about it in this presentation because we just wanted to keep it concise, but it's not well defined. It's fairly subjective in some cases. there's some guidelines that are described in the ordinance. You can go and look at them. There's some diagrams, but the bottom line is that it's not very straightforward. And so, in some cases, maybe Jared can chime in here real quick. It's like even
Well,
understanding whether you're impacted or not is not that easy.
yeah, I guess the way I would, explain this to somebody I ran into over at coffee is what you think the top of bank is not necessarily what it is. The thing that looks like the top of bank when you're standing on your property looking at it, um, it, it might be actually behind you while you're standing there looking at the creek, based on how they calculate it. So, and you
Yeah,
don't really know where it is until you get into it, and we can talk more about that later. But
yeah,
it's just not obvious and clear.
yeah. We have an example that hopefully will help people. Um, all right. So, what can you do in creek buffers? Essentially, like the premise of the ordinance is that you cannot do anything except what is explicitly allowed in the ordinance. And so this is verbatim what the ordinance says. This is how it starts essentially. You cannot do anything unless it's expressly authorized in the ordinance, and or is included in this section 070, which includes these six things. And that is it. Like these are the six things that you can do without asking permission from the city, which as a property owner probably don't matter too much to you, uh, because it really doesn't allow you to do much. That's very useful. You can plant stuff, but you can only plant native plants, for example. You can maintain vegetation that's already existing. You can clean up the area. The fire department tells you that you have to do it. That's essentially it. I mean, it's very, very limited. Uh,
So there's
hmm?
what Joan's getting at here, and what this is showing you is that the reason this ordinance has a general prohibition, and what happens because of that is there are a lot of different things that people do in their properties, like in their backyards and all, that don't require any permits from the city at all. But if you do those things and they aren't one of these six things, you're violating this ordinance, which you are violating the municipal code. So this makes a lot of people into criminals because they're doing things which are in violation of this, but they would have no idea to even think that those are things they need to go and look at the municipal code about. So you can see how limited this is, and then it sets up this issue where you've got regulations over things that right now don't require permits at all.
Right. So getting into the permits, there's a set of things that are listed in this slide that you might be able to do if you get a zoning clearance, and that requires the community development director approval, um, in consultation with the Creeks division. And essentially, these are the things. I don't think we're missing any that's included in the ordinance. You can go and check. This is the section 080. Um, but you can, if they allow you to, you can do habitat creation, restoration, or enhancement activities. You can development for safety, educational, public purposes. But even that is fairly limited. Like, for example, you can install lighting, again, if you get a permit or a zoning clearance for that. But it has to be limited lighting so as not to disturb the wildlife. Um, you can install fences, but they have to see what they call see-through, so that water can flow through them. And which kind of makes sense, but they also don't allow you to put fences anywhere 10 feet close to the creek. Um, anyway, you can do storm management, some storm management practices, some access improvements for individuals with disabilities, because that's state and federally mandated, maintenance of repair of existing private roads, driveways, trails, etc. Um, and this is an interesting point. Maybe Jared, at some point we can touch on this because there's some things in here that seem to conflict a little bit with the modification process, which we're going to be talking about in a second. Um, but in any case, like it's fairly limited. It's essentially what you're seeing here. You can do again if they approve it. But the thing here is that this approval process, in general, for things like this, you have a way to appeal the decision if essentially what you're asking for is rejected. Explicitly, this ordinance is removing all appeals processes for anything that happens inside the creeks. And so the decision is final. And your only option, if you don't agree, is just to take the city to court. And on top of that, the zoning clearance can only be issued if the director, in collaboration with the Creeks Division, determines that the the development is consistent with the rest of the ordinance, whatever that means, and the development is exempt from environmental review requirements. But at the same time, like they're asking to make sure that there's no foreseeable significant environmental impact to the creek. And so there's quite a bit of language that makes it such that it's it's not a slam dunk by any
Yeah,
means that
yeah.
you're gonna
Let's
get this approved.
this language right here that you're reading at the lower right, that's what we refer to in the planning field as discretionary. Okay, it means that they can decide whether or not they think something is the case. It's not just like a checklist where if you meet a requirement, then you pass, and if you don't meet it, you fail. It's kind of up to them whether they think that there isn't a reasonably foreseeable impact, or they might require you to provide a whole lot of information and stuff to them for them to review before they determine there's not a foreseeable impact. And all of this stuff takes time and money, and like even simple clearances right now for things that do require clearances through zoning, it's not like you go show up at the zoning counter and say, I'd like a clearance, please. Here's my application. And they look at it and say, oh, you meet everything, you're cleared. It takes, well, first of all, there's application fees, which can be hundreds to over $1,000. And they take 30 days at best to process anything. And lots of times they take longer than that. And that's just the reality. And they're understaffed. And that's why it takes so long. But it's a process, and it's a process at the end of it, you aren't guaranteed necessarily be approved. And if you're not approved, the only way to appeal it is to go to court. And the price of entry to go to court is $5,000 or $10,000 for an attorney to even talk to you about it. And to actually get it to a first hearing at court might be $50,000. And the city knows that. They know you're not going to take them to court. They know that individual homeowners who aren't like big developers are not going to have the money or the willpower to challenge them in court. So what they're basically doing is just saying, we have the power to deny you these things. And if you don't like it, then we know you're not going to do anything about it and challenge us. And that's why they've set it up this way. Most other processes in the city have what's called an administrative appeal process, where you can pay a couple $100 and file for a appeal hearing officer, or to another appeal body like the Building and Fire Safety Board of Review or somebody. And that's a barrier to entry that most people can afford. And then you can get the decision reviewed by impartial people who are going to just look at the facts. But they're doing this so that, I'm going to say, when they deny you, you aren't really going to have a way to challenge them. That's the only reason I can think of why they would set it up this way, instead of providing an administrative appeal process like they do for lots of other permits.
All right. Okay, so if the things that you want to do and your property and within the buffer zone are not listed in here, then you may have the option to, oh, sorry, I'm jumping the gun here. Let's talk about ADUs for a second. This is a late addition to the presentation. Maybe, Jared, you can cover this one because you're more familiar with it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So one of the things my company does is we design and process lots of ADUs, and we've done tons of them through the city and all these other jurisdictions. And I regularly go out and speak to groups of people about ADU law and updates to that and everything. And one of the biggest things with ADU law is there's a certain type of ADU, which is 800 square feet or less, or 16 feet tall or less, that the state has effectively told cities and counties, you have to approve these, period, ministerially, which means if it meets the conditions, like if it's 805 square feet, they can deny it. But if it's 799 square feet, they have to approve it. And what they're doing with this creek ordinance is they are banning them by default and then giving you the opportunity to submit an application where they then get to consider it as a discretionary permit. These findings they have to make are similar to findings they would make for development plans and all. And they will require you to provide technical studies and things, which cost, a geotechnical study costs $10,000. And you can't do that study until you've had a surveyor out there to survey your whole property. And that costs $3,000 to $5,000, depending on what your property looks like. So you're into it for 15,000 bucks before you've even submitted an application. And after you submit it, they get to decide whether or not they agree with these people in their personal judgment. And it flies in the face of the ADU law and the intent of the legislature. And I'm 99% confident this violates the state law. And I don't know what's going to happen, when they try to pass this ordinance, what HCD, which is Housing Community Development in Sacramento, is going to say. But it's interesting to see this, that they would put something up that so clearly converts these into a discretionary permit when it's required to be a ministerial permit.
All right. So for a few more things, you have the option to apply for an exception or modification, and that's even more complicated. That's even harder to get. And it's again only for very few things. Like if and this is one of the questions that we got, and like it's pretty frequent questions. Like you, in theory, you're allowed to replace any development that was destroyed by a natural disaster. Well, what that means though is that it is not allowed by default. You need to go through this modification process, which has many findings. There are 7 different findings that you need to prove. Essentially, like you cannot rebuild a house outside of the buffer area, you or house or structure. You cannot do this, and that, and you can go in the sections, and like it was just getting a little too verbose, so we didn't include it here. But all those 7 conditions have to be met. And in that case, then they would allow you to rebuild your structure after a natural disaster. But again, like they can still, and clearly the ordinance clearly says that they can force you to push it outside of the buffer, which means that um, if they can, they'll make you build a house like where you now have maybe some yard or maybe where you have a patio, because technically you could build a house there, right? And it's outside of the buffer zone, therefore you should build it there. Um, and because of all the other restrictions, and Jared, correct me if I'm wrong here in my interpretation, but because of all the other restrictions, you essentially would be losing outdoor space, because they would not allow you to build it in the buffer area either. You can see here that there's no mention of building patios or building or landscaping or hardscaping. That's none of that is even an option for approval. Like there's no process for you to submit approval for that, because they're going to deny that, right? And so basically what they're doing with this is they're pushing structures, or they're taking any opportunity, including natural disasters or substantial redevelopment, which is essentially if you modify more of the 50% of the structure of your roof, or a number of other cases, then that triggers also what's called substantial redevelopment. And then they're using all these conditions to essentially push you away from buffer areas, um, and um, and making it very, very hard to get an exception. Like, and also they mentioned that the modifications essentially for what they consider to be constrained lots, based on the presentation that the city gave. a few weeks ago, they estimated that about only 40 properties are severely constrained. And we've been looking at the map, and the numbers don't really add up. I think that what they consider to be a severely constrained lot is not what a property owner would consider to be a constrained
Yeah.
lot.
Later in this presentation, I think we've got more than 40 severely constrained lots just in a couple of slides that we randomly picked off of city maps, and it's going to be pretty obvious when you see it. Um, Joanne, in addition to like maybe losing some open space, there's the other problem of all the other constraints there are on rebuilding a house in the city of Santa Barbara. So, like even without this ordinance, you've got to comply with side yard setbacks, front yard setbacks, solar access setbacks. Certain distances you have to be from your properties with where you can have upper story decks. Like the city's got a lot of regulations, and when you start having to, let's say, push your house outside of this buffer and cram it all into the very front part of your property, well, then you start to run up against things like neighborhood compatibility. Like, so to get the same square footage you had in your 1 story house, now you have to build a 2 story house. And because the 2 story house is in such a tiny part of your lot, you can't get that square footage unless your 2 story house gets really stacked up and boxy looking. And the single family design board isn't going to approve that because it won't be aesthetically compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. And the single family design board on its own right now has the right to tell you you can't necessarily build the square footage you're proposing because it doesn't look the way we want it to look. So this idea that's sort of being bandied about by the Creek staff when they're talking with people, at least what I've heard people, secondhand relay to me is that, oh, you can do it. You have to just do it a little bit differently and you get this modification and you can do it. And it sort of is, not saying, yeah, but it also takes 12 to 14 months to get through our process and it costs $10,000 to go in front of the planning commission and we'll deem your application incomplete 3 times no matter how it looks when you first turn it in, and you'll have to pay consultants another $30,000. That's the reality of things, whether somebody mentions it or not. If you go try to do it, and I do this every day for clients, that is what you are going to experience. So this is creating that situation in cases where you wouldn't have that situation now. Like right now, if you need to rebuild a house or you're building a new house, if you're just rebuilding what you had like for like, you don't even have to go get design review on it. Okay. And if you're building a brand new house, your design review stops at the single family design board. And now every single one of those things is grouped together and has to go to the planning commission.
Yeah. And if you're lucky and get all that approved, and on top of that, there's in the ordinance, there's all this language about habitat restoration. And you can take a look at it, but there's just some things that are fairly onerous to property owners. Like if you need to chop down an oak tree, you need to plant 10 other ones. Well, there are restrictions about that today as well. Like I think it's 5 to 1. It's also kind of outrageous considering that it's an urban area. Like, I don't know, in my yard, I don't know that I can plant 5 oak trees and leave any room for anything else. But leaving that aside, like they're bringing in a lot of the language that's being used elsewhere in coastal zones, and that the Fish and Wildlife Department is using. They're bringing all of that stuff into creek buffer areas where today is not really applicable, at least in the majority of cases. And so you would need to do that, and then you need to prove over a period of at least 5 years that you've restored the habitat, and like you need to prove that everything is going according to plan. So that's even if you get this approved for, again, this subset of cases that are listed in here. If you anything that you haven't seen listed in the previous 3 slides, it's not even allowed. Like there's no option to even ask for it. I mean, I guess you can ask, but it'll be denied because it's just not even. I mean, it's not in the language, and therefore, because the ordinance is written as the default prohibition of doing anything. It just literally prohibited. It's just not allowed. So there, for example, there was a question that was pre-submitted around fruit trees. Like, am I allowed to replant fruit trees if they die? Well, if you go back, I think in the slide, you'll see that you can do maintenance of what's already in there, but if a tree dies and you need to plant a new one, that's not allowed according to this text. So you cannot plant a new fruit tree. And there's no modification, there's no permit process that would allow you to do that. All right. So here's a few examples. That's what Jared was referring to earlier. Again, this is just a small sample of the city. There's a lot more that I want to collect, but I just haven't had the time. In here, you see the property lines in yellow, and then the buffer area it's hard to pinpoint, especially on a map, because it depends on where the top of the bank is, and we've already talked like how the top of the bank is not even easy to pinpoint if you're on the ground, let alone looking at it from a map. Uh, there are two. You'll see two versions of the buffering here. One is like they're kind of shaded in slightly different colors. One is taken from what the city has used at least at some point in the past. We don't know where the bank is, therefore we're just going to assume 60 feet from the center line. Like, okay, well, 60 feet from the center line is kind of this more narrow area that's using here. I also, and so what I did on my own is like, okay, well, let's try to figure out more or less what the top of the bank is. Again, as an estimation, take this with a grain of salt. Those are kind of this dashed dotted blue lines that you're seeing here. This is based on the topographic maps that are available. Again, very, very high level. It's probably off. In some cases, the top of the bank is probably closer to the center line. I know that in some cases it's farther away from it, but anyway, like on average, I think you get the picture. And so this more or less shows you the range of what to expect for the buffer zone. This is the San Roque Creek in this example, so it's 50 feet because it's a major creek. And so you see here that just this stretch of creek, how many properties are impacted, and the percentage of the property that is impacted it's not a small percentage, and it's not just the property. Like you see many houses that are just basically cut in half by this buffer zone, and so technically this development is what they call non-conforming. Again, you can maintain it, but up to some extent. Like if you want to do something that's significant, they just won't allow it, or they'll force you to move the structures away from the creek. This is another example. This is Arroyo Burro. You see, like, I mean, this block, I mean, it's just completely decimated by the buffers.
Yeah, Joanne, I think like
Mhm.
one of the things that isn't clear to anyone because they haven't articulated it to anyone is what the sustainability and creeks division people think severely constrained means.
Mhm.
Okay, it may be a much narrower definition than what you or I or most reasonable or just typical people would think it can severely constrain means. I think they're saying, oh, well, these are places where, like, if an existing house got destroyed, there really isn't any space at all to rebuild it. And so that's just 40 lots, which also I just still, based on what I see looking around, I think it's more than 40 lots. But, to me, severely constrained means shucks, you just aren't allowed to do anything at all in your backyard. Like if it's outside the walls of your house, it's prohibited by this ordinance. To me, that's severely constrained.
Mhm.
So, like when you start looking at these lots where the buffer line goes halfway through the middle of your house, well, your entire yard right here, that's now city controlled open space that you can put a lawn chair in if you like, but you can't plant a fruit tree in it or, a flower bed because those aren't specifically allowed by the ordinance. And, that's pretty significant when you start looking around the city and you see how many lots have this kind of impact. And I would go further and say like these are fairly large lots we're looking at here in this slide. These are probably 7,000 square foot lots or larger in sort of a more suburban looking area. When you go over in my neighborhood over on the east side, like around Salinas, there's a lot of properties there that are 5,000 square foot lots and, 70 by 100, you know, 7,000 square foot lots or 50 by 150s. But these buffers are in the front yard of the house in a lot of those lots. So like you couldn't even have a patio in your side yard in a case like that, or maybe even in your front yard in the cases of some of these things. So to me, that's severely constrained. And I think if it was your property that was going to now be subject to this, you'd probably think that was severely constrained.
Yeah. So, Jared, like, would you mind touching on? I know it's going on a tangent for a second, but would you mind touching on HOAs? I know you brought that up to me.
Oh yeah. So I live in a condominium building that has 4 units in it, and it's next to a minor creek. So this isn't even, I'm not even talking about a 50-foot buffer here. I'm talking about a 15 foot buffer from this minor creek. And if you go, even in my case, just off of what looks like the top of the bank, that goes into my house to where, I would have to somehow take my portion of our condo building and figure out how to rebuild it outside of that buffer in the 15 feet that's left between our driveway and where I'd now be able to build. And if I couldn't do it, I'd have to go to planning commission. And the other thing is my neighbors all have to agree to let me file those applications and alter the building. And we'd have to change, because it's a condominium, we would have to change the recorded map that, is based on the airspace in our condominium units. And every single one of my other neighbors would have to consent to doing that. And, I'm lucky. I only have 3 neighbors. What if you live in a common interest development that has 25 neighbors? And now part of your job is to get all 25 of them to agree to let you go to planning commission and get a modification maybe approved to rebuild your part of their building where, their house is literally attached to your house. So, changing a recorded map, that's like a 2-year process. And it could cost $45,000 or $60,000, depending on complications. So like this isn't just a casual, like, well, you can do it, you just have to ask for approval kind of a thing. It's like a devastating 2 to 3 year long, $60,000, and you might not get it kind of a thing. And that's something I understand as somebody who represents people who are literally trying to do this on projects that require it now.
Thank you. All right, a few more examples. I think everyone gets the picture here. Um, Jared, do you want to talk about this one since you're familiar with it?
Yeah, so this is actually one of my clients' houses, and I thought this would be a great example about top of bank and how these buffers are arbitrary. They're not being determined by looking at conditions all the way up and down creeks. They're just saying it's 50 feet from top of bank. So where do you think the top of bank is in this photo? Most people would stand out here and they'd say, well, this is the top of the bank, right? But you wouldn't be right, because this is a stabilized bank. So there's a formula they make you use, and I don't know the exact math formula, but it's like 1.5 to 1 from the toe of the bank. And when you apply that formula, you end up back here somewhere. Okay. And then the 50-foot buffer applied from where they calculate the top of the bank, my client's house way up here is in that buffer. And so this is sort of a great illustration of the problem here. My client's house here is maybe 15 feet at least. The bottom of his house is 15 feet above where the top of this creek water would ever go anywhere. And his finished floor is, another 10 feet above that. But if he wants to go and, if something happens to his house and he needs to repair it or, make minor changes over here, um, he's got to go to planning commission now. And I just, as somebody who's been in land use for 30 plus years, this is just absurd.
Oh, all right. So I think based on the feedback that we've gotten from many of you, we're seeing that, and also by talking to the city, we're seeing that essentially the city is saying some things that, from our point of view, are not necessarily accurate or complete, or in some cases can be misunderstood or can mislead people to believe that maybe they might be okay when they're not necessarily are okay. Um, and I think that these are the four most representative comments that the city is providing. One is that this will streamline and simplify the review of projects near creeks. Jared has a whole set of opinions on this, and I'll let him comment on this one.
Well, I mean, it, there's nothing that you have to do right now that you wouldn't have to do under this ordinance. And there are three whole new processes that you will have to do under this ordinance that don't exist right now. So that's not my general concept of what it means to streamline and simplify. This is new regulations and new processes, and it's not like new processes which are being created that because we have them now, there are other things you don't have to do. You still have to do those things. The city isn't saying, well, we've just determined here's your top of bank, so now you don't have to spend $5,000 on a survey to figure it out. You still have to spend the $5,000 on the survey to figure it out. And then after you figure it out, then they apply this buffer. And then stuff that you wanted to do before that you maybe even didn't need a permit for, now you have to get a permit. So that's seems like the opposite of simplification and streamlining. It seems like a whole lot of new regulations.
Yeah. And so the other comment is that this basically doesn't add any regulations on top of what's already existing. As in, it's not. This doesn't restrict you from doing anything that you're not restricted from doing today already. I think that just, to me, that just doesn't stand on any grounds whatsoever. But this changes it basically frames what can be done in a buffer area. It flips it essentially. It's just saying you cannot do anything except this few things. So that alone is just should give people some pause, because that is not what the law says today. The law says, hey, here are all the things that you cannot do unless you get a permit or you get approval, which is kind of the opposite way of framing it. Um, it does establish more restrictions, as we said. Like, I mean, just starting with the very simple example that you cannot do landscaping in your yard. That's not something that's forbidden today. Um, it gives even more discretion to the Creeks Division, which is not necessarily like an additional regulation, but it is a problem because, um, based on what Jared and other planning consultants are basically telling everyone, is like essentially the Creeks Division tends to say no to everything. That's their default answer. So it is a problem, and it effectively, even though it's not a restriction on paper, it is an additional restriction that you have to deal with. It's like it's a process problem. Um, and it also introduces a lot of guidelines that are only specific today to coastal zones, and we touched on that very briefly. But now they're saying, oh well, we have this stuff in coastal zones, we have this 50-foot buffers, and you have to do all these things over there. And to simplify things, we're just going to make the entire city the same. Um, but by doing that, they're adding more regulations to the rest of the city. And then like there's things like substantial redevelopment, which is a term that's defined elsewhere in the municipal code. And essentially says like if you do two or three things to your property, then that's considered substantial redevelopment. That triggers a whole set of things like additional processes, additional findings, etc. Well, they're explicitly changing that definition only within creek area, buffer areas. to say that it's only one of those things, that if you do one of those three things, then that triggers substantial redevelopment. So that's an additional restriction. So that I mean, Jared, you may have a
Yeah,
different opinion, but it's just like
well,
doesn't make any sense to say that this doesn't add any more regulations.
let me give you some color as somebody who processes lots of applications through the city. So right now we don't have these codified buffers throughout the city. Okay. We only have it on Mission Creek. That's it. That's what's provided for in Title 30 of our municipal code. And already, even though that's the only place it's allowed, on Old Mission Creek, which isn't listed in the ordinance, the Creeks Division says, well, we're applying that buffer here too. You have to have 25-foot setback here too. And I asked them about that when I was meeting with them. I said, hey, I don't, am I missing something here? Like this says Mission Creek, but I've got projects on Old Mission Creek where you guys are applying this. Like where does it say you can do that? And like their answer to me was, well, it doesn't. It doesn't say that in the ordinance, but it's been our practice to do it. And I'm like, well, I'm thinking to myself, really? So the law doesn't says it, but it's just been your practice to do it. Like the next time I get pulled over by the CHP, I'm gonna say, look, officer, I know that the speed limit is 65 miles per hour, but it's been my practice to drive 85 miles per hour. And if he asked me why I would think that, I'd say, well, that's what our Creeks Division does in the city of Santa Barbara. But it goes beyond that. Like there's any project you have in the city of Santa Barbara right now that has any sort of a discretionary component to it. Okay, so like you've got to go to the architectural board of review for something on your house or things like that, and you back on a creek, the Creeks Division will get involved and they'll say, well, you can't do this within basically 25 feet of the creek. So even though there isn't a law on the books that authorizes them to impose buffer limitations on you right now today, they still do it. And their answer is no. Their answer is, if you want to do it in the buffer, our answer is no. And I'm talking about things like, a trash enclosure or a parking space, like not your house, things that are that simple. They say, no, you can't do that within 25 feet of a creek, even now when there's no law that authorizes them to deny it from you. And you're like, well, okay, so they say that, so big deal. Well, the big deal is that they have to grant clearance to your project when you come in for building permits and things like that. And they have to clear your project before you're even allowed to go in front of the single family design board or architectural board of review for an actual project design approval. So if they don't agree with you and you're not just rolling over and doing what they say, they won't clear your project. And, different people handle that in different ways. I say, okay, great. Well, then take us for denial at the board and we can talk about it all there in front of this whole board and see if they agree. But 90% of people are just like, they're not going to go in front of a board with creeks not clearing their project. And now this ordinance is going to give them the legal authority to do this everywhere and for 50 feet. So I'm not optimistic about how this is going to play out for people that have the misfortune to live next to a creek.
Yep. I think you touched on the next one, which essentially you can get approvals, but yeah, sure, you can get approvals, but it's only for a limited set of cases, and good luck with that. Um, and also you need to spend a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time. And so, like when they're telling people, it's like, hey, like, sure, like you can do these things, we'll let you do it. It's like you need to think that before you get to that point, if you get to that point where you're allowed to do it, you spend a lot of time and a lot of money, and you've basically been sweating bullets to get this through. So it's not straightforward, and it just makes it it's designed essentially so that you don't even bother. Because what's the point unless you have money, unless you have a lot of time or a lot of willpower? It's just not going to do it.
So can we
Um,
ask a question? Can you hear
Let
us?
yeah, I think
yeah,
maybe let's wait till we get to the end of it and
yeah,
answer
we're almost
questions then.
done, and we'll
Yeah.
have a Q&A session if you don't mind waiting for a minute.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And then one of the other things that they're saying is that the ordinance will improve safety and water quality. Well, like when it comes to safety, there's already regulations. Like there's multiple things that you need to do to prove that your development is safe if you're along the creek. Among other things, there are floodplain regulations already in the municipal code. Um, and they like the studies, the couple of studies that they cite, one is from 2003, the one that I talked about, the other one is from 2000, it's even older. Both recognize that there's the state of the creeks in the city really varies like lot by lot. It is, you cannot just say that there's a risk of erosion in the city, period. Like there might be in very certain places, but that's just not true of all places. Yeah, they're applying a one size fits all buffer. Um, and when asked about that, the answer is that they don't have the resources to essentially survey every site, and therefore this is what they can come up with. This is quite literally the answer that I got when I asked about this. Um, and then when it comes to water quality, same with habitat restoration. Like there's no studies that are backing, like there's no citations at all. There's no studies. There's no data. They even acknowledge that they don't have data on water quality in creeks today. And also there are no measurable goals. So it's essentially they're stating that they want to improve water quality, but they don't know by how much or if it's really needed or where it's needed. And on top of that, and I mentioned that in one of the on the website at some point, but if you look at any creek and you look where storm runoff is coming from, it is a lot more than the 50 feet that's closest to the creek. Like I live on Terre, off of On Terre, like all the way from Foothill Drive, the water flows down to the creek, and that's not 50 feet from the creek. That's just essentially the entire neighborhood that's pouring water down there. uh, Mission Creek on De La Vina, same thing. Like you can see like a city pipe actually is just dumping storm runoff water straight into the creek. And so I think the justifications that they've provided so far are fairly weak.
I mean the minor creek next to my house, which I love how it looks and it sounds really nice when it's raining and all, but the source of the water that flows into my creek is a pipe that's dumping runoff from Alameda Padre Serra onto our property. So the water that's already in the creek itself came off of a road that's got cars and stuff driving on it and leaving, oil residue and brake dust and everything else. And, people's dogs walking up and along it and, doing what the dogs do and leaving it there and ending up that's actually already in the water in the creek on my property before it even gets to my property. But we're saying that if we have a 15-foot buffer along that creek, that was going to improve water quality. It just there's no metrics for this or any sort of a justification for why this type of buffer or these buffers are needed to improve water quality or how they would improve it. So yeah, I'm just sort of
Yeah.
stumped as to where this came from.
All right. Um, so that's pretty much it. Everything that we wanted to cover. Just to, I know if you're on this call, you've probably done all of these things already. But just a reminder to submit public comment before next Monday. I think it's March 24th. That's the deadline. Again, the city says that they're going to come up with a new draft and they're going to open a new period of public comment, but we don't know when that's exactly going to be. Like, we don't know if we're going to get notifications ahead of time, etc. So the more you can do right now, the better. Um, Ask your district council member for a meeting and talk to them. A few of us have already done that. Um, and I think from what I can tell, they're pretty open to discussing this and understanding the point of view of property owners. And it really does make a difference if they do understand all of these things. Um, and then signing the petition, asking anyone to sign the petition that we have on the website, and essentially just spreading the word. So
Yeah,
that
really,
is,
really make sure everybody knows about this. Like a lot of people that I know who are affected by this didn't know about it. Um, when you're talking, I've seen some comments pop up at the bottom while we've been talking here, and we've been talking a long time, so I appreciate that everybody's
yeah.
still paying attention here. So we can get to your questions next. But I've been seeing a lot of stuff come up that just says like, oh, the city's just going to do what they want to do, et cetera. That's not really the case in most cases. The city decision makers, and this is the key point, you want to talk to the decision makers. Like you don't want to send lots of stuff and what you're all concerned about and everything to like the creeks staff. They're not the ones who ultimately get to decide if this gets approved or how it gets approved. The people who decide that are the planning commission first, and then after that, the city council. So if you have questions and concerns about this, I mean, certainly ask Creeks, for clarification on thing. And I gotta, reiterate what Joanne said. They've been really responsive. They were really responsive to me. They've been responsive to a lot of people who have called and asked them questions. And I can't imagine how much time that takes. And I mean, it's refreshing to see that they're doing that. But ultimately, your concerns need to be directed at the people who will actually make the decisions about whether or how to adopt this ordinance. So that's going to be the planning commission and then the city council. And just the way that this all works is whatever final form of ordinance they come up with here, that has to go to planning commission first. And they're going to have public hearings there, and they're going to consider comments and listen to everybody who shows up to talk. And planning commissioners have a more balanced view of the world than creek staff. Okay, creek staff are concerned about creeks. That's what they do. That's what their department does. Okay, but the planning commission, their job is to evaluate projects to see how those projects further all of the different goals the city has. The biggest one of those right now being, how do we produce more housing? So when the planning commission is looking at this ordinance, they're going to be looking at it in light of, well, how will these, radical restrictions affect other things that we care about, like maybe people being able to do ADUs, which are the single biggest way we're getting new housing units in the city and across the state right now. So they're going to take a way more balanced view, and they will definitely listen to your comments and concerns on this. And a lot of them have planning backgrounds, or have been, appraisers and understand how things like this affect values. And you'll get a far more sort of comprehensive consideration by them versus the people who wrote this ordinance and put it forward, which I've been in planning for over 30 years, and I don't think I've ever seen something put forward by a city or county that was so 100% one-sided, in support of one set of goals to the exclusion of literally everything else. And your decision makers on the planning commission and city council, they're going to have a way bigger picture view than the people that produced this. So definitely talk to them. It is definitely worth your time.
Yep. All right, so I guess we can open it for questions